get ready to see history, and maybe ourselves, through a bit of a surprising lens. There are definitely some aha moments in here.
Starting right at the beginning, which the source points out is not just about one type of human.
Yeah, that common picture we have, that sort of straight line of evolution, the source just throws that out immediately.
Totally. From about 2 million years ago until, well, pretty recently in the grand scheme of things, maybe 10,000 years ago,
Mhm.
Earth was actually home to multiple human species at the same time.
That's such a crucial point. It wasn't just us, sapiens, evolving alone. You had Neanderthals, Homo erectus. The source says at least 6 different human species coexisting for a very long time.
And it makes this striking comment that our current situation, being the only humans left, is peculiar and perhaps incriminating.
Oof, yeah.
It hints that maybe sapiens had, quote, good reasons to repress the memory of our siblings.
That phrase, peculiar and perhaps incriminating, it really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? Like, maybe the disappearance of the others wasn't just bad luck for them.
Exactly. And the source notes all these human species, they share this characteristic of having large brains compared to other animals. Neanderthals, actually, their brains were even bigger than ours on average.
Which leads to this really interesting question the source poses. Okay, if bigger brains are so obviously better, why is our genus, Homo, the only one in the entire animal kingdom that went down this path of massive thinking machines? It wasn't like a guaranteed win evolutionarily.
And those big brains, they came at a huge cost, right?
Yeah, definitely. The source talks about premature births, basically. Babies have to be born earlier because otherwise the head gets too big for the birth canal.
Which means you have these incredibly helpless infants that need years and years of care. Think about it. A baby horse is up and running in hours. Human babies. Huge long-term investment from the whole group.
Yeah, which ties right into social structures, cooperation. We'll get more into that. But jumping ahead a bit, the source identifies this massive shift around 70,000 years ago, the cognitive revolution.
Right. This is where history, you could argue, kind of declares its independence from pure biology.
Okay, so tell me more. What was the big change there? What drove it?
According to the source, the absolute key was sapiens developing this incredibly flexible language. It wasn't just, shouting danger like some animals can.
It was the ability to combine sounds into basically infinite sentences, right? To talk about complex things.
Exactly. Like you could not just say lion, but hey, be careful. This morning, down by the river bend, I saw a lion and look hungry. Maybe we go around the other way today. You can communicate incredibly detailed stuff about things that aren't even right in front of you.
That ability to share information about the world, it must have been revolutionary. But the real kicker, the puzzle the source tackles, is how did this language let sapiens cooperate in massive numbers, way beyond that natural limit you see in other primates, like, 150 individuals?
Yeah, chimps really struggle beyond that small group size. So how did we scale up to cities, nations?
And this is where the source introduces that really powerful idea of fiction, or imagined realities.
Yes, the argument is that large numbers of strangers can only cooperate effectively if they believe in common myths, things that don't actually exist out there in the objective world, only in our collective imagination.
It's like gods, nations, money, human rights, laws, corporations. I mean, these things shape our entire world, but you can't physically touch a nation or, dig up a human right.
Precisely. The source uses the modern example of corporations like Peugeot. It calls Peugeot SA a legal fiction.
Right.
It's an entity that exists legally. It can own things, sign contracts, sue people, but it has no physical body. It's just an idea we all agree on. And limited liability companies. The source calls them an ingenious invention based entirely on this kind of shared fiction.
That's such a key distinction. You sue the company, the imagined thing, not necessarily the person working there who made the mistake. And the source is clear. This isn't the same as to a lie.
Right. A lie works within a reality everyone already accepts. You're trying to deceive someone about something in that reality. Fiction, or this imagined reality, it creates the reality itself. It's the shared belief that makes cooperation possible on a huge scale.
So it's collective belief that builds our social structures. We end up living in what the source calls a dual reality. There's the objective world, rivers, trees, lions, and then there's this imagined world of gods, nations, money.
And the source argues that over time, this imagined world has become more and more powerful. I mean, think about it. The survival of actual rivers and trees often depends now on decisions made by imagined entities like nations or corporations.
Wow, that really flips the power dynamic. And this ability to create and believe in these imagined realities, it meant sapiens could change how they cooperated incredibly fast. You just needed to change the story, the myth people believed in.
This is how we bypass the slow pace of genetic evolution. Other social animals, their behavior is largely baked into their genes. Chimps have their hierarchies, bonobos, their ways of resolving conflict.
Right.
For them to change fundamentally, you need genetic mutations. That takes ages.
But sapiens, we could have something like the French Revolution. Overnight, relatively speaking, you switch from believing in the divine right of kings to believing in the sovereignty of the people. Society completely restructures based on a new story. That's cultural evolution, just zooming past genetic evolution.
Exactly. This super-fast cultural evolution is what lets sapiens adapt and cooperate so effectively, spreading across the globe, outcompeting everyone else.
And the source basically defines cultures as all these different imagined realities and the behaviors they create. And history. That's the story of how these cultures keep changing, starting with that cognitive revelation. History takes the wheel from biology, essentially.
Okay, so let's fast forward thousands of years. We get to another huge turning point. The agricultural revolution starts about, what, 12,000 years ago?
And here's where the source drops maybe its biggest bombshell. It calls agriculture history's biggest fraud, or maybe a trap.
Yeah, it completely turns that standard story of progress on its head. The source asks a really simple logical question. Humans were successful hunter-gatherers for 2.5 million years. Why on earth change a winning formula?
And then it lays out the downsides for the average farmer compared to the average forager. Often a worse diet, relying on just a few staple crops like wheat or rice that lack nutrients and are tough on the teeth.
Less security, too. A forager has diverse food sources. A farmer's whole year depends on that one wheat crop not failing. Yeah. And the work was generally harder, more repetitive, more backbreaking than foraging.
So why? Why do people do it? Why make life arguably worse? The source suggests it wasn't a conscious choice, but a gradual slide, a miscalculation based on short-term thinking.
Like, oh, if I just work a bit harder planting this wheat, I'll have more food next season. You don't see the long-term consequences, the population boom, the total reliance on that single crop, needing even more hard labor just to feed everyone. It's the luxury trap.
You invest more for what seems like an improvement, but that investment locks you in. You need more and more effort just to maintain it, even while the overall population grows. The source even brings up places like Göbekli Tepe.
Right, those huge pre-agricultural temple sites.
Suggesting maybe these large communal projects driven by shared beliefs existed before settled farming, and maybe that drove the need for agricultural surplus to feed the workers building the temples. It's fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
And alongside crops, you obviously get the domestication of animals, the rise of pastoral societies.
There's also that really counterintuitive point the source makes about our brains potentially getting smaller since the foraging era.
Yeah, the argument is pretty stark. To survive as a forager, everyone in the band needed sharp wits tracking, plant knowledge, navigation, social intelligence, agriculture, and later industry created, as the source puts it, niches for imbeciles.
Wow.
Places where you could survive, even thrive, just doing repetitive tasks, relying on the skills and knowledge of a smaller group of specialists. You didn't need everyone to be a multi-skilled genius anymore.
That really flips the script on progress, doesn't it? You compare the forager's life-varied diet, physically demanding but skilled, with the early farmer's monotonous work, less nutritious food. It's not a simple story of improvement at all.
Not for the average individual, anyway.
Okay.
So, moving on from agriculture, the source looks at how these imagined realities allow for even more complex societies. Beyond small bands, beyond villages, you get the first cities, Jericho, Çatalhöyük.
Then kingdoms, like ancient Egypt, and eventually the first massive empires, like the Akkadian Empire.
And this is where these imagined orders become absolutely crucial for holding millions of people together. The source dives deep into Hammurabi's code as a prime example.
Right, that Babylonian law code.
It was explicitly designed, according to the source, to enable cooperation among millions, mostly strangers, by setting down rules supposedly dictated by the gods. It created a very clear, rigid hierarchy.
Yeah, superior people, commoners, slaves, all with different rights, different punishments for the same crime. It defined property, including owning other humans. It was all spelled out.
And the source makes the parallel. Modern ideas, like the American Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal, with rights.
Hmm.
That's also an imagined order.
It contrasts it with biology, which would say, well, actually, everyone evolved differently, characteristics change, there's no inherent equality gene.
Exactly. The point isn't whether Hammurabi or Jefferson was objectively right. Neither order exists in physics or biology. They are belief systems. They work because enough people believe in them, and that belief allows for effective cooperation on a massive scale.
And both justified their orders in similar ways, actually claiming they enabled a stable, prosperous society. Hammurabi said hierarchy did that. Jefferson said equality did.
But because they rely purely on belief, these imagined orders are inherently unstable. They need constant effort to maintain.
Yeah, the source points to the need for violence, coercion, armies, police, courts. Think about the effort to enforce Hammurabi's laws, or the American Civil War fought largely over the meaning of that imagined order about equality.
Another incredibly powerful imagined reality the source unpacks is money. It's presented not just as coins or shells, but fundamentally as a system of mutual trust.
It's the thing that allows total strangers to cooperate economically. I might not trust you personally, but if we both trust the value of this piece of paper or this digital number,
Then we can trade, build complex economies. The source gives examples like barley money in ancient Sumer, how currency names like the denarius and dinar echo across empires.
and the almost universal belief in gold, shared by cultures that had little else in common, Chinese, Indians, Muslims, Spanish conquistadors, driven, the source says, by basic supply and demand, reinforcing the myth of its value.
It describes economic history as this kind of delicate dance, relying on money to make everything work while constantly worrying about how it might corrupt relationships or values.
Okay, shifting gears again, maybe around the year 1500, we hit the scientific revolution. The source highlights three key things that made it different from earlier ways of knowing.
First, and maybe most important, was a willingness to admit ignorance. The Latin word ignoramus, we do not know. Science starts from the assumption that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah, that's a huge shift from traditions that thought all the important stuff was already written down in ancient texts or known through divine revelation. The second big difference.
The centrality of observation in mathematics. You don't just rely on tradition. You go out, collect data, run experiments, and you use math to analyze it. Statistics become crucial, even in fields like psychology now.
And the third key difference. Using this new knowledge to acquire new powers, especially through technology.
Though the source points out that science and tech weren't always linked. For a long time, they were separate fields. That systematic connection, using science to drive technological innovation, was itself revolutionary, really only cementing in the 19th century.
Like in World War I, the source mentions, scientists were actively recruited to invent new weapons, poison gas, better tanks, planes, a direct pipeline from scientific discovery to power.
And here's where the source makes another really provocative link. It argues that modern science and European imperialism were basically inseparable. They fueled each other.
It uses Captain Cook's voyages as a perfect example. They were scientific expeditions, yes, mapping, collecting plants, figuring out scurvy using sauerkraut, interestingly.
But they were also military and imperial ventures, planting flags, claiming land for Britain, paving the way for conquest, and, tragically, the destruction of many indigenous cultures.
The source sees a shared mindset there. The scientist and the conqueror both start by admitting ignorance. I don't know what's over that horizon. They both feel this compulsion to go find out, to explore.
And both hope that the new knowledge they gain will give them mastery, power over what they discover.
The example of maps is really telling. European maps started showing blank spaces, terra incognita, explicitly admitting they didn't know it was there. Older maps often pretended to show the whole world, even if it was wrong.
Columbus sailing west based on calculations, even though his calculations were wrong, fits this mold of venturing into the acknowledged unknown.
And the source contrasts this European drive with other powerful empires at the time, like Ming China. Admiral Zheng, he commanded huge fleets, explored the Indian Ocean.
But lacked that same, as the source puts it, insatiable ambition to explore and conquer completely unknown territories and claim them permanently. It was a different mindset.
Science also gave empires a kind of ideological cover, right? Framing conquest as a progressive act because it produced new knowledge advances in geography, biology, archaeology, often came directly from imperial ventures.
Definitely. Okay, fast forward again. The Industrial Revolution. The source emphasizes the absolutely staggering increase in human power over the last few centuries, especially since the 1800s. You see it in population numbers, production, energy use, just off the charts compared to all prior history.
And the key was tapping into new energy sources. We went from relying almost entirely on plants, food for muscle, wood for fire, to harnessing fossil fuels like coal and oil, then nuclear, solar. It's like discovering an enormous ocean of energy, the source says.
But this industrialization, it didn't just change how we worked or what we produced, it fundamentally ripped apart traditional social structures. The source talks about the collapse of the family and the local community as the main organizing units of life.
Before industrialization, your daily life, your support system health, education, welfare, elderly care, it all revolved around your immediate family, your extended kin, your village or neighborhood. States and markets existed, but they weren't deeply involved in those personal spheres.
The Industrial Revolution changed all that. People moved to cities for factory jobs, breaking those tight community and family bonds. States and markets stepped in to fill the void, providing schools, police, welfare systems, jobs, consumer goods.
But that left an emotional gap, didn't it? Losing that intimate community connection.
Yes, and the source introduces the idea of imagined communities, things like the nation or the consumer tribe fostered by states and markets to create new forms of belonging. Shared language promoted by state schools, national myths, mass media, brands, these replace the face-to-face community. It's another layer of imagined reality becoming dominant.
The source also discusses the rise of modern consumerism. For most of history, frugality was a virtue. But capitalism needs constant growth, constant sales.
So the ethic flips. Consumerism becomes good. Buying things is encouraged, even framed as therapeutic treats without remorse, as the source puts it, necessary for the economic engine.
It also touches on how industrialization imposed rigid timetables on everything. Factory whistles, school bells, train schedules, clocks everywhere, structuring life in a way that was totally alien to pre-industrial societies.
And the source raises the ethical cost, particularly regarding animals and industrial agriculture. It argues that while their objective needs like food might be met, their subjective, evolved needs like a calf needing its mother, as shown in Harlow's monkey experiments decades ago, are often completely ignored. A profound question about the consequences of our power.
Yet amidst all this change and potential suffering, the source presents some surprising statistics about violence. It notes that in a year like 2002, more people worldwide died by suicide than were killed in wars and violent crimes combined.
Suggesting, perhaps counterintuitively, a long-term decline in large-scale human violence. It also points to the relatively peaceful dissolution of most European empires after 1945, and how rare wars between major global powers have become compared to history. Maybe, it suggests, humanity has somehow managed to break the law of the jungle in international affairs, at least for now.
Which loops us back to maybe the biggest question the source asks. With all this unprecedented power, are we actually any happier?
It really pushes back against that simple idea that progress, happiness. It uses the agricultural revolution, that potential trap, as Exhibit A. More collective power didn't necessarily mean better individual lives.
The source's perspective is really interesting here. It suggests happiness depends less on our objective circumstances, how rich or healthy we are, and more on the gap between those circumstances and our subjective expectations.
Right. If things get way better, our expectations often shoot up just as fast, so we don't feel much happier long term. If things get worse, sometimes our expectations shrink, cushioning the blow. It's about the gap.
Like winning the lottery doesn't usually lead to lasting happiness because your baseline just resets higher.
Exactly. And the source adds this potentially humbling biological take. Maybe happiness is mostly about pleasant biochemical sensations in our brains, hormones, neurotransmitters. And maybe our biological system is designed to keep happiness levels fairly stable around a set point. Evolution didn't select for constant bliss. It selected for survival and reproduction.
So those pleasant feelings are more like temporary rewards to guide behavior, not a sustainable state.
That seems to be the argument, which really makes you rethink the pursuit of happiness. And this leads into the final section, looking towards the future. The source calls it the Gilgamesh Project.
After the ancient king who sought immortality.
Exactly. Humanity's modern quest to overcome death and gain godlike abilities, but using science and technology this time.
It notes the incredible leaps in medicine just since the 1800s, beating infections, safe surgery, doubling life expectancy in many places. Things we take for granted were unthinkable not long ago.
And then it gets into biological engineering. From historical practices like castration to modern genetic modification, cloning, and cyborg tech, like those bionic arms controlled by thought that people like Jesse Sullivan received. The lines are blurring.
The source even speculates about a possible second cognitive revolution. Not driven by language this time, but by directly tinkering with our brains. Small changes could potentially create entirely new forms of consciousness, transforming sapiens into something else. Superhumans, perhaps.
The ethical debates are huge, obviously. Political obstacles, too. But the source seems skeptical they'll hold back the tide for long, especially when things like radical life extension or significantly enhanced abilities seem within reach. The temptation might be too great.
And this raises a deeply concerning possibility about future inequality. The source suggests that these biological enhancements could turn the old, often baseless claims of aristocrats about being inherently superior into an objective reality. You could have biological castes.
Creating potentially the most unequal society ever, based on biology itself, not just wealth or status.
And the source ends with this really chilling thought. We tell ourselves stories like Frankenstein, where attempts to play God fail, reassuring us that we're still the pinnacle.
Right. But what if science succeeds? What if we create something genuinely superior to us? Something that looks back at Homo sapiens the way we look back at Neanderthals? That's quite the thought to leave us with.
Definitely something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. So what does it all mean for you listening? We've journeyed through Harari's take on humanity from being just one species among many, possibly wiping out our siblings,
To becoming planetary rulers, powered fundamentally by our unique knack for creating and believing in shared stories, these imagined realities.
The source really hammered home the power of these fictions. Ancient laws, gods, modern nations, corporations, money-enabling cooperation on a scale unmatched in nature. But also their fragility, the constant effort needed to keep believing.
And it threw serious doubt on that simple story of linear progress. Key moments like the agricultural revolution. Maybe not such a great deal for the average person, even if our collective power grew. We might have walked right into a trap.
We saw how our modern world, globalized economy, nations as imagined communities, the relentless drive of science and industry is all built on these deep, often messy, historical layers and the imagined orders we inhabit.
Which really raises the stakes for today, doesn't it? As we're potentially on the brink of redesigning life itself with biotech AI,
Yeah.
what lessons should we be taking from this history of powerful ideas and their often unintended consequences?
And maybe the most provocative takeaway to leave you mulling over is that idea about happiness. It's not really tied to our external achievements or even lasting inner feelings, but maybe more to our biochemical thermostat. What does that mean for how we live our lives individually and collectively?
Yeah, what are we actually striving for? Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.